Well, good afternoon and welcome to our session talking about education policy and changes that we expect to see in 2021 as we move into the second quarter of the year. You know, we had a large federal election that received a lot of attention in November of 2020, but states had a number of elections as well. We had 44 states that held legislative elections, 11 states held gubernatorial elections, 9 states elected new members to their boards of education, and 4 states held elections for their chief state school officer. So lots of changes in the individuals that are coming into roles responsible for education policy in states, from early learning through K-12 and into post-secondary in the workforce. So I'm really pleased to have a discussion today with 2 individuals, Dr. Aaron Thompson, who's the president of the Kentucky Council on Post-Secondary Education, and Dr. Sydney Dixon, the Utah State Superintendent of Public Instruction. We're going to talk a little bit about how different policy issues are playing out in these 2 states that are represented here on the panel, but also with the national look of issues we see forthcoming. And we'll share a little crystal ball expectations of what we might see as we move throughout the year. So Aaron, I'd like to start with you with just a question. If you could share with us a little bit about some of the good work that's been happening in Kentucky around data interoperability and really this challenge that we're facing in the education space to connect the information we have about students and their learning with information about workforce needs in states and communities, and how our data systems can support more intentional and informed policymaking to support community growth and development.
Thank you, Brian. Good to see you. You know, when we think of data, I tell people that, folk are always saying we're data driven. We are, we look at our data and it points out problems. You know, in Kentucky, what we're trying to do is really look truly at the data and analytics and what it tells us and where we need to go with it. And I'm happy to say we have KY stats, and then we have, which is a big P20 way of thinking about data, and it's housing data, but we're also getting the workforce data, we're getting health data. We're taking all that and what I call rolling in it into a big ball, and it's informing all of us, whether it's in our health services or whether it's in our criminal justice system even, but as well as higher ed and P12. And it's telling us that all of this stuff fits together. Now, my argument is that higher education matters. And the reason why it matters, if you look in Kentucky, that 90% of those that are on unemployment have no post-secondary credential. If you look at those that are on SNAP or that's getting Medicaid, 89 to 92% no post-secondary credential. If you look at people that are using the most extreme health services that we have, you'll find the same thing. So all of this should be telling us stuff. But we also have to recognize that this conversation starts at the P12 level in our minds. This is really a P20 way of thinking about the pipeline. And it's also a way that we find when students are dropping out, not just of college or of high school, when they're dropping out based on some other condition, such as not seeing the usage of going to college, or somehow having some other health issues, or somehow having, in many cases, mental health issues that we've seen really exacerbated through this pandemic. So we're using all that information to inform policy. And we're looking at it, I'm working with the criminal justice system now here in Kentucky to talk about how can we reform the educational aspects of criminal justice, like our state police, from basic training all the way through leadership. How can we look at all this to even not just think about what's happening during the pandemic, about what's happening with Black Lives Matter? How can we draw upon those data that we know that tells us about the problem, but informs us about solutions? So this is how we're using data unlike any, and we, not only that, you can go on our website and do it yourself. We can get you down to the most minute level that will tell you a story. It will tell you a story about kids from our Jefferson County Public School District based on race, gender, and a variety of other things to see what happens to them in aggregate, of course. We don't mess with purpose here, but in ways that helps us to know how to identify at a formative level of what we can do to help those students before they get to a point of needing extreme help, if you will.
Yeah, Aaron, let me ask you a quick follow-up on that. So you mentioned sort of the different components of, state and maybe more municipal or localized government, different systems, criminal justice, health, workforce, education. What's the sort of the way in which this data approach, this holistic data approach that Kentucky's taking is sort of governed and managed in terms of their work groups that come together from these different sectors to tell a common story about what's happening in the state, or just a little bit on the practicalities of how this works in practice?
It's an excellent question. Our KY Stats, which is our P20 data warehouse, it's actually in the Cabinet of Workforce and Education. However, I sit on the board, the commissioner of P12 sits on the board, and the Secretary of Workforce and Education, who happens to be our Lieutenant Governor, sits on the board, and then the person in charge of our financial aid, we sit on the board. Now, we just expanded it to put our health folk on the board, the Secretary of Health and Welfare. So what we say is that let's talk about what the big conversation is, go out and get the experts where the rubber meets the road, bring them in, let them inform us about what the conversation should be or the questions that should be asked, what data should be explored. But we do, we're blessed enough to have some good folk in our shop. And data, even in CPE, as you all know, the higher education data, we have a rich data set that we add to that P20. But we use our data set to even microscopically drill down, as well as the health and education folks drill down. But this board, along with the staff, identifies how can we actually create a seamless process of allowing something to be proactive versus reactive, right? I mean, because data can do two things. You can look at it early enough and you can use this analytics to do good stuff proactively, or you can wait till something has happened in a summative way and it's dead, and then you do nothing with it other than say, boy, we killed that one. So that's the way we are approaching this one.
That's great. Thank you. So a couple of themes there, and Dr. Dixon, I'll turn to you. We sort of heard about the connectivity across different sectors of our public administration space to think about, supporting students and communities. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about with an example from there is the commitment that Utah's made to English language learners. And this was an approach that had been of importance and a top tier policy issue in the state and your localities pre-pandemic. And I'm sure there's been some interest across the country in how the pandemic environment for education, K-12 education in particular, has been impacted here. But if you could talk a little bit about that example of the way in which the systems in Utah have come together to really support education for English language learners.
Yes, of course. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. Happy to talk about both our challenges and our opportunities in Utah. I think Aaron addressed it well when he was talking about data and how we sometimes spend a lot of time admiring the data and analyzing the data and don't always act on it. And in Utah, as we continue to look at our data, showing that our students who are learning English tend to sit below their peers in a lot of categories of standardized achievement and other areas, we felt it was really important to take a deeper dive and look behind that data. So we have spent a good deal of time going in and working with district leadership and charter leadership. So really trying to build the base and the infrastructure so that everybody can succeed on their own given the right circumstances. And for us, that meant going into classrooms, actually taking experts out of our office, a cross-sector team, and going into classrooms, into schools, and just giving a lot of rich feedback, providing that feedback to the district and to the school principal, and talking about emerging themes. What are we seeing? And then maybe here are some things to try. And principals in our schools have said to us it's some of the best feedback that they've ever received because it was very actionable. So then you provide support for the district all along the way to put those practices in place. And we've seen great strides made in just the shift in school culture and classroom culture. The other thing that we've been very intentional about is rolling out services for digital teaching and learning and support. Now, we all closed down across the country in K-12 in the spring, and that put a lot of people into an emergency learning situation. So we were a little bit ahead of the game with being able to provide tools But what do you do for families where they don't generally connect with school? They don't speak the language. So some intentional efforts on making sure we had people to support us from the refugee communities. So districts were going out, charters were going out, getting tools out into the homes. But one of the most significant things was really in the fall, bringing families in a very safe way. Glass partitions, all of the things that you need to do with masks and hygiene, but bringing families in and explaining to them, here's the tool, here are the opportunities, here's who you connect with, sending IT personnel out into the homes, working with community leaders to make sure that broadband, which was the key, it's an essential utility really, and making sure that everybody had access. So we saw some great things emerge for our families who their primary language is not English. And some of this cross-sector with living in conditions of poverty as well. Communities coming together and spending their CARES dollars on putting up cell towers. So it's not always just about providing a hotspot or a tool. It's everything together that encompasses that. How do you do school effectively in a remote setting? And then when you're coming back to school, which we did primarily face-to-face, knowing that students might be home on a Friday, they might need additional support based on the family conditions of work, of illness. We had to look at all of those conditions and make sure that all of the support was in place for equitable access to education. So pre-pandemic, we were doing a lot of work going into the schools and providing quality feedback with follow-up and support, making sure that we engage families all along the way. Pandemic hits, making sure students have support, including targeting broadband support into communities where it hasn't been before, on our reservations in inner city spots where the broadband just hasn't worked well or at all, up in remote canyons, etc. So now what lesson do we learn from all of that? It's still critical. It's everyone's job to engage families. It's everyone's job to think about the issues of immigration, of language, of all of those elements that we take the child at the door and sometimes we disengage the family or the community. So those are lessons learned for us, and we've seen progress. And so we're recognizing that progress. We're calling out elementaries, middle schools, and high schools and giving them awards for closing achievement gaps with our students who learn English. And it's been a tremendous boost to all of those in the system who are starting to see their efforts pay off.
No, that's great. Thank you for that. And what I appreciate about both the topics that we've talked about and the examples you've shared is there really is, a challenge of bringing together people, not just from the education policy space or the education practice in our schools, but, you mentioned, Sydney, broadband, you mentioned immigration, we've talked about workforce development, we've talked about health systems. And so I do think one of the things that we've certainly witnessed from my vantage point at Education Commission to states and working across the country with state policymakers is a more holistic approach that was driven by a requirement in the pandemic to sort of respond at a community scale to things that have happened. And I'm wondering from each of your perspectives about how durable that kind of more holistic approach to thinking about serving students and families can be. I know, Erin, you think a lot about innovation in education policy and practice. I think there's a lot of lessons that we've learned over the past 11, 12 months across the country that suggest maybe a new set of normative practices to support education at all levels. But I'm curious from each of you, just a little reflection on some of the things that we have had to do out of necessity over the last year that we really hope can become the way we approach education provision and policy as we move forward. So maybe, Erin, I'll start with you and then we can just talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sydney is hitting on, concepts and terminology that I love. It is about quality and equity. Let me just say that all this discussion we have, it boils down to those two. What we saw even before the pandemic, we knew we had a mental health thing going on, right? We knew in our P12 and higher ed that it was ever an increasing issue. We were paying attention to it then, but during the pandemic, we really paid attention to it because students were telling us, parents were telling us. We also knew that we were losing adult learners before that. We started paying more attention to talking with folks. We knew that we hadn't gotten employers in on the front end as much as we should have to design programs for 10 years from now versus immediately. So we're building a nursing pipeline now quicker because of that. We're going to keep that up. Some other things we learned though. I mean, we learned that when March came of last year, COVID happened, Kentucky and many other states, the FAFSA fill out went down. So we brought a team together. My team, I'm happy to say, led this. We brought all kinds of groups together from the communities, from the workforce, from other agencies like our financial aid folks, as well as universities and P12 people, from Pritchard Committee, who's an advocacy group. And we said, we've got to do all that we can do. And because of that, we even sent out snail mail for people that couldn't get the information because of the digital divide, which is another issue we can pick up. That, because of that, we ended up a fairly flat enrollment, right? Versus 20% down like many other folks. But we also learned some other stuff. We learned that students in higher ed, we concentrated heavily just on the delivery of the academics. Well, we realized that students didn't mind coming to campus and still doing classes online. They were good with that. What they weren't good with is they weren't good with not having people around them to do it. So how do we perform the social, emotional, and cultural elements of that? How do we make sure then that we were already behind the 8 ball with our low-income people and our people of color? And I'm proud to say that Kentucky has done a pretty good job of closing those gaps in the last 3 or 4 years. But we realized that this was going to have a big effect. So we looked at the homes, and even those that had internet, to find out that they didn't have enough capacity because mom, dad, or whomever was in the household, along with the students doing the work, couldn't do it all. So we still have a deficit. So we now see that when we talk about the digital divide, it becomes even a different definition and what we need to do as a state to supply that. And I keep on going. Our libraries, we run the virtual library in my shop, and we realized that we had to do far more innovative items to make sure that the kids at home and the parents and other family members at home got information at a quicker rate. How can we help them to do that? But the interesting piece, I think we learned that we probably knew, but we didn't take advantage of, that this is all systematic. This is all of us into this game together. This is where that data comes in once again. We're able to get information now faster than we've ever been able to get it. We created, what came out of this, we created a mental health process, I call it, in building the capacity on the campuses, as well as building a technology capacity that's run out of my shop now that would allow at least some triage to get people what they need faster. We found out it wasn't just the amount of service that we offered, it was how quickly people could access it based on certain issues that they were having, and it wasn't one size fits all. So we were able to really dig down and disaggregate, what those issues are to serve that. But we also realized that in the process with our workforce, that women were being displaced at a much faster rate. We talked about needing childcare. Well, this thing came to really, out there for us. So now we're designing ways where we can work with all of our constituencies within the communities, as well as a statewide level and federal aid, hopefully, to help us to provide them with that. And I keep on going with this conversation for a long time, but I'll let Sydney jump in and talk more about it. So all of these things has now created innovation currently. We're not just waiting for COVID to be over to do it. We're putting these things in place now, and they will stay in place, and we will keep in a formative way looking at how we make them better.
Yeah, Cindy, lots of themes there for us to pick up on. I think one in particular that we might touch on is to start some reflections on what's happening in Utah. I heard you mention it in your prior response around English language learners, but really effective communication, effective and timely communication to schools and families and students about supports available to them. And then I also think there's been more of an effort on getting information from students and families about what they need in a different way to sort of customize that. So maybe we can start with a little reflection on some of the innovations that you've seen in Utah that take place that you're hoping stick and become part of normative practice moving forward. But I also do want to get a chance to talk with you about the good work that Utah's been leading around personalized learning plans as well. So maybe we can toggle between those two a little bit. And I know that's of interest to Erin also.
Sure. Well, I think that it all fits together, actually. A couple of years ago, we let out on a strategic plan, and everybody has a strategic plan. And we've had them before and they sit on shelves, and we decided to approach it a little differently in that we hyper-focused on 4 areas: early learning, effective teachers and leaders, safe and healthy schools, and personalized learning. And of course, all of those have goals and strategies attached to them. They lay under the umbrella of our mission and vision, which is making sure that every student is ready to succeed and lead, not just be successful, but be able to lead out when they leave our system. And the way we do that, our mission, basically is by setting the equitable conditions. And that means advocating for resources and examining policies to make sure that they are equitable, et cetera. So given that backdrop, and we were headed down that path, we were able to coalesce a community around these ideas. Oftentimes when you have a state board or a state agency set a list of goals, it feels like it's just for you. And while that was certainly the case, by engaging stakeholders to create those goals and then pushing those out through our legislative actions and asks, our governor's office. We have a governance model of 15 elected board members. I'm hired, appointed by those board members. So we have a legislature, a governor, and a state board of education. And then we're very much a local control state. I know everyone says that, but we all try to make sure that things happen at the local level as much as possible. So given that structure, how do you put forward goals that everybody can buy into? And we certainly found that not only were those the right goals, but then the pandemic hit, and those were the very things that we needed to focus on. Certainly the social emotional well-being, the mental health of our kiddos and our families and our educators in the system. That has, the trauma of it all has really exacerbated the need to focus in on great strategies in our schools that highlight well-being. And so if you have quality instruction and quality supports and the well-being of students, that makes for better outcomes. We certainly know that it takes effective teachers and leaders. Think about what they've been through during the pandemic and what we've learned. So that could be a whole other hour or two, just talking about what we've learned with instructional strategies. And early learning, just by keeping focus on these 4 areas, even in a pandemic when revenue isn't as high as you would like it to be, our legislature, we're about 3 weeks left in our, we have about 3 weeks left in our legislative session, and they have prioritized early learning. So 2 strategies from our board that we believe will pay great dividends. So just that laser focus, not shifting course, but staying on the tracks. The train gets a little wobbly through the pandemic, but we stay the course, stay on the tracks. So, the last thing I would add is this, the portrait of a graduate. And that is an aspirational document for us. It's a roadmap that we've put out to all of our schools, and we've seen it adapted and adopted as a way forward to think about what should a graduate be able to do, what should they know, and what should they aspire to when they leave our system. So we use the acronym MAP to stand for Mastery, Autonomy, and Purpose. And within that, you can find content, you can find critical thinking and problem solving and a service orientation and empathy, all of those kinds of things that can be taught and should be taught. So really thinking more holistically about what an education should be like in Utah. And the portrait of a graduate that was there pre-pandemic has been the thread that's carried us through the pandemic and has really helped personalize education. Because if you look at that map, it's about an individual map for a student, for every student to master the content, to find autonomy and purpose in their lives through the opportunities that are afforded in an equitable system through public education. So I can talk more about portrait of a graduate, but that really has been for us a way to keep the focus on personalized learning that doesn't ebb and flow with a pandemic. It's a constant aspirational way to think about schooling, and it'll drive us into tomorrow and into the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. It's been great. I do want to, as we get to time here, I like to leave these panels with one question. We can have tight responses and answers, but I'm always curious about the one thing that is keeping you up at night that you think about, and the one thing that gets you up out of bed in the morning that excites you about what you're been able to do in support of your constituents. So Aaron, I'll maybe turn to you to kick us off. One thing that's keeping you up at night and one thing that gets you out of bed in the morning.
Well, the thing that's keeping me up at night, we have, and it's been going on for the last 5 years, our college going rate from our P12. It's not at 50.5%. That keeps me up. And the people that get left out of that are a significant group of people that may look like me and be poor. You know, and when we think of higher ed as the direct correlation between a great economy and a great workforce, that pipeline I have to consider. If I want to have a great higher ed system, then the thing that gets me up in the morning is I'm going to work hard toward a great early childhood system and all the way through P20. You know, Brian, I know we're going to run out of time, but I set 4 goals when I took over years ago, and that's actually to make higher education important to everybody in the state, to really focus on affordability. I'm proud to say that the last 2 years has been the lowest tuition in the last 30 years and 0.7 last year. The third is to focus on equity at all levels. And to do that, just to let you know, you probably have seen that we've closed gaps significantly in the last many years. And the last is to make quality education where everybody, our employers, our students, and everybody would know it's quality. A couple of things we've done, I would ask states to consider. When I took over, I basically outlawed all developmental education. You know, everybody had to go to a co-requisite model. Because of that, we've seen tremendous increases in success in those courses that they used to fail in and the courses afterwards, and they're graduating higher. Our retention rate's at 80% throughout the system now, and everybody's doing well. But we have to be intentional, and it has to be a P20 intentional way of thinking about it. We cannot actually afford any longer to point fingers. We've got to get our families, our communities, our institutions, as well as that student him or herself involved. That wakes me up every day and excites me that I get to help lead that process.
Yeah, well, thank you, Aaron. Thank you for the good work you're doing in Kentucky, and certainly for the examples that you've provided for others across the country to learn from. Really appreciate it. So, Sydney, maybe for me, one thing that's keeping you up at night and something that gets you out of bed in the morning.
I just want to put exclamation points on what Aaron said. I completely concur. And I think the thing that keeps me up at night is the same thing that gets me up in the morning. I wake up truly in the middle of the night sometimes thinking about equity and just making sure that we're providing ways for our students to have access and opportunities, to have choices for their future. Without access and opportunities, their choices are very limited. So that's the thing I worry about, that I focus on. It's also a great opportunity. I love our Portrait of a Graduate. I'm so excited about it because it's an aspirational document that really is driving a lot of innovation in conversations, in thought, and in practice. So we just see amazing trends happening. We see people willing to give up what I call the 3 Bs: bells, buses, and butt time, which is really seat time and in a more appropriate language. But we still have some really stagnant systems in place that have been artificial barriers to moving forward. And through the pandemic, I've seen great innovation where schedules have been unpacked and people are thinking about different ways to engage with families. So I see great hope on the horizon, not 10 years down the road, but today and tomorrow. And so I'm very excited about the possibilities we have to move forward with the things that we put in place, but to really amp up our efforts around what works best in a very personalized way for each and every student.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sydney, to you as well. And I take away the 3 Bs that's a good little nomenclature to hang on to for all of us, and really appreciate you sharing all the good work that you're leading with your colleagues there in Utah. So thank you both for joining me on this panel, and we look forward to getting together in the future.
Thank you all. Good to see you.